Looks like we are now recording.
Awesome. Okay, so um, last week, as you will recall, do you remember those old things, those old serials? Last week we finished up with the 2 in, 3 out components, which now leads us to the 3 in components, which gives us we get into some really interesting territory around about now, because this is, first of all, we're going to be talking about a lot of the color components. There's a lot of different kinds of mixes, and there's also all of the stuff that refers to working with Voyager, all of the mathematics inside of ArtMatic that actually allows you to control the 3D spaces in Voyager. So we'll start with the 3 in, 1 out tiles, and you'll see there's quite a lot of these, and probably this group of these tiles, the 3 in, 1 out tiles, are probably the most diverse of all of the groups of tiles in ArtMatic. So you can immediately see that the components are arranged into whole lots of quite different groups. And that is, again, mostly because we've now jumped into the space of components that control materials and shapes and things in Voyager. So they're not exclusively for that, of course. You can use these components in anything that you like, generating straight flat designer images, 2D images. And in fact, there are actually quite a lot of really nice components for generating textures in here, which can be used. They're actually 3D textures, so you can use them inside of Voyager, but they can actually be very, very useful inside of this sort of 2D designer world as well. So I'll just kind of really briefly describe what some of these do. You've got a little group here, which are kind of all things that sort of sit outside other things. We have lots of math tools here, for various kinds of things. Mostly these things are to do with mixing, so mixing components together. And you've got a couple of things here that are generators as well. This dot plane line one, you'll find you use a lot when you're in Voyager, because it can actually generate a flat Voyager surface, which can become the basis for building landscapes. You can use this by modulating it with various kinds of noises. You can actually build a flat surface with modulated landscapes. And if you've seen any of Dick Skirchinger's wonderful landscape worlds, this is kind of where he basically starts, with really kind of flat surfaces which start to get modulated. Then we've got some logic tools. Again, these are mixers. They basically take the inputs coming through into this component and mix them together in certain ways. It's like the 2 in, 1 out mixers that we talked about before, but of course this one's got 3 independent inputs, and you can mix all of those 3 inputs together. Then we've got, and these are kind of mixing tools as well, where you can blend the 3 inputs coming in. So you've got various ways of actually blending them. You'll see that some of them have got this blend by alt, which means blend by altitude. And this means that you can actually create surfaces in ArtMatic that have got kind of altitude, and the blending is controlled by how much of that you want to happen at certain altitudes. And a random mix, which just random mixes 3 inputs together randomly. This can be really useful if you wanted to do something, for instance, like create a landscape that had different kinds of patterns in it. You can mix them together so that they randomly occur throughout the landscape. So it's very useful for that. Then we've got some shaders, which are just kind of basic generators that you can use to get these really basic things. Some displacement functions, which I won't go into now, but we might talk about at some stage, and a pack component. The pack component, again, this is a very common one, actually, the 3 in, 1 out pack component, where you would use this all the time just to take an RGB stream and squish it down into one channel so that you can mix it together with something else at some other stage. What else have we got here? Some more generators. So these generate kind of, again, very basic patterns. All of these that are prefixed with 3D means that not only will you see them go across the Cartesian plane, but you'll also be having a vertical, a z-axis depth to them as well. So they're useful for creating three-dimensional noises. And these three-dimensional noises can be combined with shapes in order to put textures onto DF models. That's one of the things that you might use them to do. And likewise, if we just skip over to the side here, the same thing with all of these ones that run down this side here. These can all be used to create three-dimensional shapes, three-dimensional textures and noises that can have various uses inside of the Voyager landscape. These are the kinds of things that you can also use, not just in the flat landscape and on objects, but they can be used to create textures that can be used for noise, for clouds as well, for skies. So this is the kind of area that you'd be looking to do anything where you wanted to make lots of complex three-dimensional spaces. Then we get to the shape generators. And these are the things that you will use if you're starting to build things in Voyager, building objects and building regular landscapes. So these patterns and surfaces are good for building things like streets and regular shapes in the environment. The most common of these are these first three, and these are things that define all kinds of different shapes inside of Voyager. 3D shapes. So let's just select one of those and we'll have a look inside this. Oops. I should also just remind everybody that when we select these, anything that has a hash mark after it like this, it means that it's going to give us some alternatives when we select it. So I've selected the basic one here, but when we look down here, we can see that we have a whole lot of things that we can actually choose from here. And so if we select box, we've actually got a three-dimensional box. We mostly, we look at these, it would be unusual for this just to be existing in its own right like this. A lot of the time when you're making 3D or DF objects, you're actually using some form of color to map to them as well, because they, if you just use them like this, they'll just come out as like a default white. There'll be no actual color to them. In fact, let's have a look. I'm just going to swap over to Voyager. So if we look over to Voyager here, you will see that this DF object here is exactly the sphere that I had in there before. So let's just have a look at that. So what I've done here is I've just called this a sphere. And over here in Voyager, we can see this is a sphere. I've got Voyager linked here to ArtMatic, to Designer. And so when I change something inside of Designer here, I will actually get a reflection of that in this little window, which is previewing what Voyager is seeing. So I just want to show you how we swap these things out for different shapes. So you'll see, I'm just going to put in a tile here to rotate this so that you can see that it actually is, in fact, a proper sphere, proper cube. So you can see that this is now a cube because I've swapped it out with this box here. I can make it a cone. I can make it I can choose any of these things. And that is a basic depth field object being rendered inside of Voyager. The color that's on that at the moment actually is only coming from the sun, but it is actually white because there is no color mapped to this at the moment. It's just one straight output. Whenever you have this one straight output here, you're basically just, in Voyager, you're just mapping white to it, I believe. I don't think this has anything to do with it. Let me just check that. No, yeah, so even the color lookup tables don't have any effect here when you're inside of Voyager. It's really just mapping the output of the shape itself. Now, I will show you at some stage how we work with color inside of Voyager, but that's not for today's lesson. That'll be a little bit more advanced. So we'll just go back into looking at the components here. So that's a shape. These are the basic shapes, and so those three choices there, all the things that are called shapes, give you different forms of shapes. and different kinds of things that you can just pop in there. Lots of selections there, and they're all good basic building blocks for building things inside of Voyager. If I was to drop in one of these patterns or surfaces here, you'll see that this is kind of like an infinite surface. Doesn't really help us much here. It's not the right way to use this. And the same if we use something like 3D textures. You can see the textures here, but it's kind of like a big infinite kind of plane of textures, which are not really that useful for you at this point in time. They're better used being mapped across to one of your DF shapes when you come to use that. We also have here some fractal instances, and these are again fractal generators. They're not 3D objects. They're not meant for being used in 3D. They're although you can use them in 3D, they're actually there to create complex shapes for building fractal systems. And then we've got a group of noises, and then some different noises here, and then a whole lot of stuff which is purpose-built for using in Voyager that create things that look like rocks or clouds or ocean and so forth. But once again, they're just kind of noises. So even though they're called that sort of thing, you can use them for all kinds of things. They're just generators of various kinds. They have a particular use inside Voyager, but if you wanted to be playing with them inside of ArtMatic Designer, there's no real reason why you couldn't do that at all. So I'm just going to go back and we'll just forget Voyager for a little bit. And I think I've talked about most of those. So let's go into the next one of these, and it's a 3 and 2 out. Now, once again, just to remind you, I can get that little dialogue up there by clicking on my control key, and it gives me the ability to choose from any of the available components that we have in Designer. So again, we have a group of quite diverse components in this field of 3 and 2 out. They have many, many different uses. These 3D scale and offset components are mostly used. So I think I should explain this. We've got 2 outputs here. So this kind of means that some of these tiles will be used as space distortion, 2D space distortion components. And so some of these 2 output ones are useful for when you're using looping components, because the 3rd input allows you to control the way the iterations in a looping system happen. And when we get, I think maybe in the next lesson, what I'll do is I'll start talking a little bit about some basic building structures that you could use, and we might talk about loopers and how loopers work. We have, so again, if we pop in some of these ones, you'll see these are more 2-dimensional things. They're putting out 2 streams. It's again changing the 2-dimensional aspect of the Cartesian plane with an extra 3rd input dimension, which allows us to kind of change various aspects of it on a 3rd input. A few uses for doing that, but again, I won't go into them right now. Then there's some things that are pertinent really just to Voyager here. Some things that are to do with creating sort of like a fake version of perspective. The best way to show this, oh no, it's going to have something underneath it to do this. Let's look at something like, oh no, we need a generator here. Let's get rid of this. I'm not doing this properly. I've done something wrong here. I've completely screwed this one up. Can't even remember why that doesn't work for that. Anyway, I won't dwell on it. Projection tools which allow you to project something onto something else. And that's quite useful for, again, for putting textures and images in ArtMatic onto something in Voyager, but you can use it also inside of ArtMatic as well for various kinds of things, particularly when you start using the kind of pseudo 2 in, 3 out.
So Peter,
Oopsie. Yep.
If I wanted to take the lovely pattern you had just a minute ago with the circles and put that on, say, the torus you were showing earlier in Voyager, I would use the projection for that.
Yes, you could do that. Absolutely could do that. So the projection tool, in that case, you might look at something like spherical projections, of which there are some very varying kinds. I won't actually go into doing it because it means I've got to build a structure inside of Voyager to show you how to do that. But yes, you would use that, and then it can spherically project onto that object in such a way that it looks like it's kind of following the contours of that object. So there are two ways that you can put colors and textures onto things in Voyager. One way is to project them on, and another way is to use a kind of a combination mode, which kind of maps them on in a different way. And you can do it with both textures and with just kind of plain colors as well. So I'll talk about that when we go into Voyager in a bit more detail. And my plan is when we do Voyager, we'll go into a very basic system of maybe just a sphere or just a donut or something like that, and we will put textures on it and we will put images on it so that you can see how you can do that inside of Voyager.
Great.
But so you can project them on, which is one way of doing it, and you can sort of like combine them in a 3D way as well. There's two different ways, and they have different ways of working, and they have different advantages and different disadvantages to them as well. We have a thing called revolutions and sweeps. This allows us to take, this is specifically for creating objects inside of Voyager, allows you to create quite complex objects by taking one object and then, or taking a flat shape and then revolving it in space. Now, this is what we'd call in standard 3D terminology is what we call lathing. You basically can do something like if I was to take a flat circle, I can then rotate it, lathe it through space and make a sphere from that circle. So that's what that does. I'm not quite sure why they're grouped here with these things, which are very, very different. These are kind of things that kind of change the 2D space again. Then we've got some tools for various kinds of fractal noises and displacements, and a couple more for things that have various uses inside of Voyager as well, as do these ones here, which are for creating constructs. And so you see nothing happens in the screen because it really doesn't make much sense to ArtMatic without it having the right connections. Then a group of spatial noises here that again have uses once you get into Voyager for creating things like clouds and surfaces and stuff like that. Once again, they are quite good for using inside of just ArtMatic Designer systems as well. And if you do have any of my old interactive texture and background library systems, you'll find that I've used these a few times to do various kinds of noises. They're a little bit more flexible than some of the other noises, and they have some really kind of cool things in them, like this rich fractal displace and stuff. I think, you know, Eric's designed these mostly for use inside of Voyager, where they have, they apply to landscapes. They look like landscape things. But once again, because we're just dealing with maths, you don't have to stick with that stuff when you're working inside Designer. You don't have to say, well, this is only exclusively useful for working inside of Voyager. It's actually got some really cool things that you can do just in the Designer system as well. And then we've got a group of mixers again, which a couple of which are logic tools. Logic tools, which we'll see a little bit more, are tools which allow you to take two streams of something and then mix them together with using logical operators, so that you can add them together, or you can subtract them, or you can use the intersection of two things. So if you've used a program like Bryce, you'll understand how these logical operators work. You have a sphere and you have a cube, and you put them together. You can combine them as one thing, or you can say intersect, so you'll just see the intersection of the two things, or you can make the negative space of the two things. So logical operators are useful for making those kinds of logical combinations of specifically for 3D objects, because that's where they come into their own. There are versions of them. This is just a min-max kind of component, which will do the same kind of thing. It is really just essentially a logical operator, but it's just has a little less control than you get out of the strict logical operators. And then we have a few things to do with 3D fractals. There's some very good demonstrations of this particular component inside some of the example files. These are fantastic when you get into making 3D fractals inside of Voyager. They're just an unlimited number of incredible 3D fractals you can build from this component. And it's basically putting out two linear streams of a different kind. And I might, at some stage, show you how a fractal is built up with this particular tile. There are demonstration examples in the modules you get with Voyager, but it's probably worth running through it, because one thing people don't understand is how flexible this tile can be. It does generate certain kinds of things like the mandelbulbs and stuff like that, but you can also combine it with other things to get the most incredible changes. Very, very much well worth exploring any system you see with that in it. Okay, so let's go on to our next one, which is the 3 and 3 outs. These are incredibly versatile tiles, and you'll find yourself using these components for lots and lots of different things. Once again, a huge variation in the kinds of things that they do. But this is kind of like, when we were back earlier on, remember we had the 2 in, 2 outs, and you saw the way these they can manipulate the space that you're actually in, the two-dimensional space, the space manipulations. They can generate things, they can mirror things, and they can create noises. Well, this one, the 3 in, 3 out, is kind of the 3D version of that. So it does almost exactly the same kinds of things, but this time we're working in 3D space. And that means that you're only seeing on this particular field here, you're seeing a 2-dimensional version of a 3-dimensional space, but it actually has that 3rd dimension as well. And so we can do things, for instance, like create a sphere. Now, this is not a true 3D sphere, because we're looking at it inside of Voyager, inside of Designer, and so therefore we're only seeing a flat representation of a 3D sphere. Why has it moved my canvas like that? Oops, and I'll just show you some of the other ones. There's a different kind of a 3D sphere here. There are some things, there's a tube. You see that very well. I'll just put a texture on here, so kind of get a better feel for what these things do. So you can see that there is a 3rd dimension coming into play here. Then we'll go on to these elevation slices. These allow us to kind of like take slices through the z-axis of something that's being created inside of this pseudo 3D space. Now, you used to see a lot of this in the older versions of Designer, where we didn't have Voyager. So there was no real way of creating true 3D spaces. So Eric had a lot of examples of how these 3D slices, elevation slices, used to work. They need to be connected correctly, but I'm not going to go through that now because I'll forget how to do it. Same with density slices. It's the same thing. It's basically just looking down the axis of the 3D plane and taking slices of that axis. If you look through the my texture libraries, you'll find that I've used those a few times because you can do some really cool things, particularly if you're looking down the z-axis of tiles like some of these things like the line networks. It allows you to take a slice of the z-axis and then combine it back with another slice at a different spot and bring them all together, and you can get these very complex kind of slices combined with one another as you go back through the z-axis.
Are your texture libraries still available?
The texture libraries, no, we took them down because they are not compatible with CTX. CTX has kind of broken a lot of the things in the texture libraries, and I went back to try and fix them, and the amount of work is just phenomenal. And to be honest, some of the components don't work the same way, so I'd have to actually reinvent them. So if anybody wants to get a copy of the texture libraries, I'm quite happy to provide them. But they do not work with CTX any longer. They only work with the older systems, which is a great shame. But I am working on another one, so it'll be a CTX friendly one, which will have some new stuff in it. I'll just need to get off my bum and do that stuff. But the elevation slices don't have any real use in Voyager, so you can't actually, they're not things that will actually translate at all very much to the way that Voyager works. They're purely for creating sort of pseudo 3D effects inside of Designer. Then we go across to a group of generators of various kinds. They make what they say, so 3D Marvel. These are really useful for mapping textures onto 3D objects, but you can again use them in a 2D system quite happily, and you can put them onto the faux 3D things like the sphere and stuff. So if I, for instance, I put in one of those 3D spheres just here, that will kind of get fake mapped to that 3D sphere. And if I put in a rotational thing here, you'll see that.
I like that term.
Oopsie, that doesn't do that correctly there. It's going to be underneath it. What's that? Faux 3D?
Fake mapped.
Fake mapped, yeah. So it's kind of rotating the texture across the surface of the sphere there. But because the texture is true 3D, it will kind of quite happily swirl around there and look like it's quite realistic. Dick Skirchinger put up this fantastic little trick on the Worlds of ArtMatic list just the other day, where he's kind of done a fake rotation of the front surface and the back surface of this. It doesn't really have a back surface in a true sense, but he did a trick where it actually looks like it does, and he's made part of it transparent, so it looks like you've got a fully rotating 3D sphere on the flat surface.
This is how he did that.
Yeah, it's very clever. Very, very clever.
Very sneaky person.
He is a very sneaky person. Yeah, you can do that stuff if you know enough about it. Yeah, so they're just kind of color generators, and there are some more of them across here. There's some caustics, and these are lovely noises, and you can use these for a lot of things. If you are on the ArtMatic Worlds of ArtMatic list on Facebook, you might have seen some of I was experimenting with some clouds recently, and what I wanted to do was just to try and map some of these 3D colors against some volumetric clouds inside of Voyager to see what the effects would be where you're just mapping random colors across the clouds. It's not a realistic effect, but boy, it really did look spectacular. So I have some more things that I'll do with that in due course.
And if you aren't on the Worlds of ArtMatic group on Facebook, you should be. Because if you're at all interested in this, there is amazing inspirational material every day.
Yeah, it is fantastic just to see, what people are doing with both Voyager and with Designer, because it doesn't matter how much you think you know about these applications, someone will figure out something quite remarkable and different about how to use them, because we're basically working inside a programmable math synthesizer, so we can do all kinds of great things. So it's very, very much worthwhile belonging to that Worlds of ArtMatic list, just so you can keep an eye on what's possible, because there's some pretty truly spectacular stuff being done. In this, so we're going to just drop down a little bit here. We've got these 3D patterns. This is a pattern generator, which again really doesn't have much application in 2D. Whenever you see something that has DF in it, it's talking about the depth field 3D rendering that Voyager does. So DF things have very little use inside the standard ArtMatic designer 2D fields. They don't make a lot of sense to it. Then we're going to drop down into some color tools. So one of the things, when you're inside of the 3in, 3out components inside of ArtMatic, you are also being able to manipulate directly the red, green, blue RGB color stream. And the color stream, it's just values. It's basically values of either red or green or blue. And so if you have access to those values, you can pretty much do anything you like to those values by tweaking scales here. It kind of defaults into this sort of look because it's not really mapped to anything. So it's really just looking at a kind of a really blank screen here. But if we were to map it to an object or something, we can actually change the colors quite dramatically. In fact, let me just, I'll put up a, I'm just going to put up a color generator here. So this is just basically a constant. So just to show you how this works. So what we're doing is we're driving the full luminosity of this, the full color field of the screen with just pure RGB. In this case, it's all equal values, so it's all going to be white. But here we have a 3in, 3 outputs component at the bottom. And so if I start playing with one of these 3 values, X, Y, or Z, in this particular case, it's going to be manipulating the color. And so when I start moving stuff on the X scale, I'm actually moving the red value. You'll notice I can't go into the positive here because you can't really get whiter than white. So it's adding, what you're seeing happening here is equal values of X, Y, and Z. They're being added together. So the only option I have in this particular case is to subtract something, because I can't go more because it's white, it's total white. It's not going to get any whiter than that. But I can pull red out. And of course, if I pull red out, then I'm going to get cyan or blue. If I pull green out, I'm going to start going into, well, let's just make that one nominal. If I pull green out, I'm going to start going into the magenta. And if I just reset those and I pull out some of the blue, I'll go into the yellows. So that's what will happen. If I start pulling these all down here, and then I push one up over that value, you'll see I'm now pushing up the red because we've got positive red values. And this will be positive green values, and that's positive blue values. So that's this component acting as a direct manipulation of the red, green, blue color stream. But I think I remember telling you this last week, but this is also a tile that has another use, and it can be a space manipulation tile, because we're again just manipulating the values of the X, Y, and Z coming through it. So not only does it serve that function, you might see that tile further up and it would be serving a different function. So I'm just going to show you that by putting in my beloved, oh, Caleb, this is one of the things that doesn't work any longer. So I'm just going to show you this. So normally if you put in a Gaussian dot here, and this is how you connect a child tile to a parent tile, you hold down the one you want to connect, and then to get it to connect automatically, you hold the command key and it should just connect. It's not doing that properly in this case. So what it would have done in the past is it would have just connected to that. So instead now what I have to do is now I'm holding down Option and Command, which will bring up this dialog, which now allows me to make the connections manually. And I'm just going to put that music to into out. oops, this one will work. So that I just connected by holding down the Command key, connecting it to that one. It automatically made the connections. So some of them work, some of them don't work. I'm not quite sure why that's changed now. What was I going to? I was just going to show you how putting in this. Let's try and make this a 3 in 3 out. Bear with me here. That one did work. I'm just going to put in a 3D object here to show you. Let's make it a square because that won't actually work otherwise. I'm just going to show you how this component here, exact same component. I think I might have done this last week, but when I put it up here and change something in the component, it's changing the values of the space above it. So I just created, a different shape by altering the space values. But if it's down here, it's going to change the color values. So it does a different thing according to where it actually sits in the tree. When it's above an object, it's doing one thing. If it's below an object, it's doing another thing. So it's something to keep in mind. And many of these particular tiles work in that fashion. So I'll just kind of run briefly through some of these. So we have I started on that, didn't I? So we've got some color tools down here. We have these space manipulation tools here do various things. There's some more derivatives happen here. A new 3D reflect one, which is really lovely tile. I won't explain derivatives just yet. I'll do that in a separate thing because they're complicated and they sort of span across various components. The mirrors are like the 2D mirrors that we have. So instead of manipulating something in 2D, they're manipulating things in 3D. And this means that you can actually use them inside of Voyager as well to create all kinds of extremely cool mirror functions. You can see there it's mirroring just across one axis. Let's just offset it. Let's see, where did it go? Not doing that very well. Probably not a good choice of tile there to use for that. These things are a little difficult to demonstrate without having 3D, and I don't want to really go into 3D at this point. That is actually mirroring it there, but you can't see it because it's mirrored it out of existence. It's flipped its axis, so it's kind of vanished. You can see what it's doing there. But because this is a 3D mirror, it's not just mirroring the symmetry in 2D axis, like up or down, it's mirroring in the z-axis as well. And this allows us to create all kinds of extremely complex objects when we get into Voyager. They can be objects that kind of can look like they've got many dimensions to them and are mirrored in various different ways. When you use it in conjunction with other things like fractals, it allows you to get very, very complex and very fascinating systems. And there are a couple of different forms of mirrors as well. You've got a 3D repeat and tile, which mirrors or repeats and tiles in 3 dimensions. You have straight mirror, plane mirror. You have this tile here, which this is particularly useful when you're trying to build kind of organic looking shapes. It does a thing where it takes a 3D object, a DF object, and it creates either bends or adds various kinds of textures to them. In this case, it's going to add ripples down the XZ axis, but it also allows you to do all these kinds of cool things. Undulate, which means wobble in various dimensions, put spikes and bumps on things. This is quite good for building up complex organic looking objects inside of Voyager. So you put that in front of a 3 in 1 out tile, for instance, say if I had in a 3D shape here, I would be using this to manipulate this shape. Let me just see if I can quickly show you that I'll just bring up my oopsie, just going to move my mirror here, my screen here. Simple sphere. I'm going to see if I can do this really quickly just to show you how these things can actually be used. So you remember that's my simple sphere that I had before in Voyager, and I'm going to put in that undulate and distort thing there. I'm going to make this into something other than a sphere, just a cylinder, because it's easier to demonstrate. And I'll just make it a bit taller on the y-axis. And if we switch across to make interactive now, let me just select from one of those options. Oops, it's gone away. Let's try some spherical bumps. Bear with me here. Let's zoom out a bit. Spherical spikes. Maybe have to put this on a sphere. And we'll change the number of spikes. Oh, it's the amount and the scale. You can see that what it's doing now is it's applying this. This is basically a distortion, a 3D distortion. It's applying this 3D distortion to the object that's sitting under it to give you these kinds of weird shapes. Oops, sorry. I'll just choose another one to show you something different. These are ripples. So you can see it's modulating the shape that's sitting underneath it. That's one way of doing it. That's like a direct modulation of the shape. Likewise, we can put other things in there to modulate that shape. Like we could put in a random noise. That's now modulating the shape in the function of a noise. It's also demonstrating something inside of Voyager where the scaling is incorrect, which is a whole world of pain. But I'm not going to talk about that right now. If you use the straight kind of distorts and bends and things, you generally get into scaling problems there because they're very kind to the objects in that case. So that's what that 3 in 3 out component would be used for. Let's just go back into ArtMatic. I can just switch this off. Let's see what else we've got to play with here. We've done the color tools, done the color generators, noises, and then we have a group of various kinds of mixes. Once again, these are similar to the 2 in 3 out mixes, but in this particular case, we now have 3 inputs. So instead of just mixing 2 things together, we can mix 3 things together. And you can see this is a very simple version. This is one of the simplest versions. This is a packed Rgb Crossfade. So what this expects to see is 3 packed red, green, blue streams from 3 separate strings of the tree. It wants to see 3 packed ones because it's dealing with 3 independent streams of RGB, and very simply it's just mixing them all together using the amplitude of each control. So when you set it up like this, they're all equal. It'll mix 3 RGB streams in equal manners. And there are various kinds of ways of mixing those 3 streams. You can use the maximum values. These are similar to the 2 in 3 outs that we've seen before. So they're kind of the same basic idea. They just mix things together. And you have a maths one as well, same as a 2 in 3 out. So you can mix things together, mix streams together to preserve colors and preserve various kinds of things in the RGB streams. I'm not going to dwell on these things because they're so complicated that to kind of go into them, there'll be a detour that takes us way too far in the wrong direction. I kind of need to talk about each of those things in a specific instance with some examples so that you can see them more clearly. So don't worry if you don't understand them just at this point. As we get further up the line, I'll start building systems and we'll start talking about these, and you can ask questions about what they do exactly. And then we've got some just straight mixes. These are not mixing RGB streams, they're mixing just straight scalar values, and which can be used for making terrains and all kinds of things. You can mix objects with these things as well. And then we've got some memory components, and you'll remember that we had the memory components from some of the other systems as well. And memory components, again, I'll just explain, is when you're using systems where you're trying to loop functions back through the system, it has to remember that you've put something through the first time and that you want to go back through and do it again. So you need a memory function. But again, I'll do some examples of these so that you can actually see how they work with an actual example. They'll make a lot more sense that way. So that kind of ties up most of those, I think. So let's go into the 3 and 4 outs. Immediately when we select this, this demonstrates one of the properties of systems that have 4 outputs, and that is that it can contain an alpha channel. And an alpha channel, I think we've already seen this earlier with some of the other components. An alpha channel is a transparency channel, which allows you to composite things together. You can composite things together inside of Designer. So you can actually create composites with one thing in front of another thing inside of Designer, but you can also output the alpha channel as an alpha channel and composite it in other applications. Also now I believe we have movie options which allow us to generate movies with alpha channels, which is new for CTX. And that's quite useful because that means that you can generate a moving image that has a transparency channel, and you can composite with something else, maybe in another application. And those sorts of things are really great if if you're wanting to do things like put in a special effect on top of something else in one of your live action movies or something like that.
So it was a nightmare not having it before.
Yeah, it's really useful, but also it has to be said, generating an alpha channel with QuickTime was not something that a lot of apps could do before. So it's, having that facility inside of the new 64-bit system actually makes it something that's easier to do. And people use it all the time when you're using, doing special effects work and you're doing all kinds of editing work. You need those alpha channels. So if you had something like Final Cut Pro, no problem. You could run with those things all the time. But it's not something that a number of image programs had when it came to movies. You've been able to do it with still images for a long time, but not with movies. So it's made a lot easier now. So the 4th output signifies that there could be that alpha channel present. It doesn't always mean that, but because again we're talking about mathematics, so it doesn't always mean that. But generally speaking, if you see a tile that has, let me just put in another tile so I can show you this. If you look at the tile here, you can see that it's got the RGB there, and then it's got this gray output as well. That means it's got an alpha channel. So that's how to tell if there's an alpha channel present. So we have a group of components here, and some of these again will be familiar in certain ways because you'll have seen something similar before. But we have something like a color circle, or the Gaussian dot, which we have here, which is exactly the same as the Gaussian dot that we had in our 2-in, 1-out systems before. But now we're actually also outputting alpha as well. So we have an RGB dot. So we can change its color. We have the ability to actually change its color to other things. But at the same time, it's also outputting a transparency channel as well. So we have the ability to kind of make shapes that can be composited over other shapes. And a various number of selections of those kinds of things there that we can use as well. Nearly all of these have got an alpha channel of some kind, so you can see you can composite these over other things. Just show a group of these things. A group of tech noises, and it has that hash sign after it, so you can see that we have some extra choices of things that we can put up here. Again, very good for creating things where you want one thing in front of another thing. You can always disable the alpha channel, by the way. There are ways of actually not having it. So if you connect a 4-output tile at the end here, you'll always have the alpha channel, but you can change this to a 4-in, 3-out tile, which now means we're only outputting RGB, and the alpha channel disappears and will always go to black, but it means that you can just have a solid image if you don't want to have that alpha channel there. Another thing that these components can do, aside from outputting an alpha channel is that they can actually output a value. So this value that's coming out here can be used inside of Voyager to map a three-dimensional value to an object. So it's a little complex to go into for this explanatory thing. But as you remember earlier, we had the 3-in-1 outs, these components, and I explained that we can use some of these noises or surfaces or textures to map to a DF object to give texture to an object. When we're talking about the 3 and 4 outs and the I think some of the 4 in 4 outs, this last component, this last output can actually just be taken by itself as a 3D texture from some components, and you can use it to manipulate the textures of objects as well. So it's quite, it doesn't have to just be, for instance, the lunar rocks with the colors of the lunar rocks. The actual last channel here can take the texture of the lunar rocks and map that texture to something else. So it serves as a potential other kind of texture generator when you get to working with DF objects inside of Voyager. Just something to keep in mind, and I may show you some examples of that at some stage. We have a group of fairly esoteric little things here, which I won't go into. The 3D leaves is for generating leaf-like things in Voyager. This allows you to create a sky dome, which is kind of a thing to do with the way we create shading and the looks of things inside of Voyager's skies. We've got a grass field, which does pretty much what it says. This is a volume sweep, which is not unlike the 2D one we saw before, just has a little bit more flexibility to it. Over here we have some things which you will use a lot in Voyager, and these are jittering things. These allow you to take an object and make many copies of it, but those copies can be jittered, which means that they're not all regular. You can take a sphere, for example, and jitter it so that it creates many copies of that sphere randomly or in various ways. So we can jitter them in a spherical pattern. This will make no sense unless there's a depth field object attached to it. You can jitter them so that they are jittered on several kinds of axes, and you can jitter them as if they're tiled, so they can be tiled in 3D space, but irregularly, or regularly if you wish. So it's quite a useful tile for just creating, many instances of an object. And then you might use this, for instance, if you'd created, so Dick has created these grass-like things which look like little clumps of grass. And then you'll find this tile is used in that system. So it allows you to make many, many different versions of that grass, which are rotated and a little bit offset. So they look a bit random. So you can get a patch of different clumps of grass. That's how you would use that tile. We have some kind of textures which are mapped in the Z dimension here, which have certain uses. We have a group of generators that allow you to generate certain kinds of things, which do pretty much what they say. Once again, these can be mapped onto 3D objects and 3D spaces as well. I often use this 3D green marble to give cracked textures to things, because you don't have to use it as marble. You can just take the component that controls the cracks and use that in its own right to make cracks. Then we have a group of, again, these mixer components, and these mixer components are again similar to the ones that you've seen before, but the difference in this component is that it allows you to mix things that now have an alpha channel. So you can actually mix two streams from the tree and preserve the alpha channel in that mix. So when they mix together, you'll have two objects, let's say, that are combined in some way. They both have an alpha channel, and now that alpha channel is preserved into the final mix of those two objects. So you can make complex shapes that have an alpha channel with them. And there are various ways of doing them. And once again, you'll see there's maths tools and there's logic tools. There's a new bunch of tools which are called which have an alpha component in them. So this is a compose component that allows you to do things with the alpha component as well. Then we have a 3D looper, and this is a looper like the 2D looper, which I briefly explained last time. The looper actually takes something coming through it and allows you to iterate that back into the tree. We're using a memory component, put it back into the tree and repeat it several times, or however many times you specify. So the 2D looper component just does that in the X and Y plane. The 3D looper component now allows you to do that in the X, Y, and Z plane. So you can actually you can loop a DF object so that it now will be reproduced inside of Voyager, now looping in 3 dimensions. So just like our mirror was mirroring in 3 dimensions, we can loop something in 3 dimensions as well. And these are really great ways of making very complex shapes inside of Voyager very quickly. So you can end up, if you put a looper and a mirror together inside of Voyager, you can get a shape that looks incredibly complex in a very quick way. Something that would take a very long time for you to do if you were modeling it in a traditional 3D application. Okay, so now we'll jump into the 4 in, 4 out components. No, where am I now? 3 in, 4 outs, 4 in, 1 out components. Let's just get rid of that. Not so many of these components because they have various uses to do. Again, mixes, they can generate things. One thing that you'll notice is these motion paths, which we did see before in the 2 in, 1 outs, where you can generate motion. This is basically allowing us to have a 2D motion path, but also a 3D motion path, so we can move things in 3 dimension. This only has any effect if you're talking about animation. It's obviously a thing that takes place over time. And this allows you to take an object and to move it in space using you know, a motion path. So you can cause it to actually move in space. We have some more mixes of various kinds. We have a couple of tools here which I've never played with, to be honest, so I don't know what they do. A random mix, which will now mix 4 independent streams together, 4 independent DF streams or scalar streams together, and a couple of noise generators as well. 4 in noises, I'm not sure why. I don't think I've used that either ever for anything. I'm going to change that. I'm going to find out what that does, and I'm going to use it in something. Then 4 in, 2 outs, which are really kind of nice set of components. I like these. These are really useful, mostly again for only for 2-dimensional designer things. And they take 2 spaces and they compare them with one another and then join them together. And you can do also all sorts of interesting things by combining 2 spaces in different ways. You'll see there's a lot of complex combinations. So this immediately tells you that you can make some interesting fractal work with this. It's comparing 2 sets of spaces and combining them using complex operators to create interesting fractal spaces. And you'll see there's some kind of fractal things happening down here, which you can use as well. They can just do something as simple as interpolating 2 spaces together. And if you've seen any of the effects that I've done with what looks like refraction effects, like glass effects in some of the things that I've done, this is basically the trick that I'm using. I'm just comparing 2 sets of spaces, and then I'm offsetting 1 space against another space, and it gives the effect of refraction if it's done in a particular way. And I might go through one of those systems at some stage so you can play with that. But it's a really nice way of getting quite complex things. So if I was just to let's just add some things here. I'll just show you how you can do this by having just a couple of systems comparing to one another here. So maybe not that one. Let's look at twirl. Doesn't do much there either. Usually, sometimes you need an object. So again, these are things that kind of just manipulate the space. So often it's good just to have an object in here to do this with. Oops. I'm just going to put in a little dot again, and ripples is always good. So I'm comparing these 2 spaces with one another now. So one of them is ripples and one of them is a dot, which is not doing anything here because something on it, like tiles. No, not either. Not quite sure. So sometimes this, does things that you don't expect. Yeah, it's not really doing much there. I'd have to kind of set up a system for that. I'm trying to do this on the fly, and it always surprises me when I go, oh, I know how that works. And then I realize, no, actually, I have to figure out something for that.
Part of its charm.
Yeah, part of its charm. But it essentially just compares these two spaces together, so it allows you to kind of make these combinations. I use this a lot when I'm working with strict designer systems where I want to compare one space to another space in some interesting way. Whether I'm offsetting one thing against the other or whether I'm combining things together. So it's useful for that kind of stuff. And you can do it in various ways. There's all kinds of ways that you can actually do these things, so they can be split in kind of various ways where they're combining one thing to another thing and creating boundaries and other things like that. It's worth playing with just as a fun exercise. Take two space objects, two space distortions here, and compare them together and see what they do, because you can get some really interesting results from just that one tile. Split it into 4 pieces as well. There's lots of things to do with that. There's also a motion path render here. This is a 2D motion path render. A 3D motion path render, it actually will combine 2 sets of paths and render them for a 3D motion path. Probably nothing much I need to talk about there. You'll see this tile occurs a lot in Eric's Utopia system, where it's being used to drive lights and reflections. Kind of whiz through these. We're nearly done. 4 in, 3 outs. These are usually kind of mixes and color manipulation tools. That's what they mostly do. I won't even dwell on these because they need to be demonstrated inside a system for you to understand how they work, but they're mostly mixes. These color manipulation tools here are useful for getting very precise control over color, and also for driving control of color with things like iterations. So it's a really useful tool to actually, for instance, if you want to iterate a circle, iterate a sphere, and have it iterate many times, you can drive the color so it iterates the different color each time you have a new iteration of the sphere. That's what you would use those for. And 4 in, 4 out's our last component. This component again has many different functions. These are kind of just space functions again. These functions here are really, really interesting, and we'll talk about those in terms of fractals, 3D fractals, when we get into that. They allow you to transform the space in various complex ways. Extremely useful for getting very complex and interesting fractal systems in 3D, but I won't talk about them here. And then, a number of ways of combining colors. These ones take some of the stuff from the gradients and put them into the 3D, but also allow you to have an alpha channel. So they're the same as that you will have seen those ones in just the straight RGBs, where you can take the actual gradient up here and flip it down into the RGB space, and therefore use your gradient to drive your RGB space, but also allows, in this case, to have one further channel, which is the alpha channel. And then some color controls, which also preserve alpha channel, and then a few memory components, which have more to do with when you're joining 4 inputs and outputs, which again allows you to have memory with an alpha channel. It's a long way down the line before we get to those, so don't worry too much if you don't understand those. So that's it. That's really it for the lightning whiz tour through all of the components of ArtMatic. So I know that that's very dry, and it's just kind of like looking at a whole bunch of things which just probably have a lot less meaning to you than they will have when we go through some examples. So any questions from you guys about anything we've talked about here?
I think exactly what you just said, Peter, which is that now we have all this constellation of tools and some understanding on what a 2-in versus a 4-out is versus a 3-out, kind of what the purpose of having the number of ins and outs are in these different tile sets. And the next thing is to see the application of how you
Yeah.
execute a specific task.
Yeah. So what I intend to do, what I think I'll do next week is, I'm going to start off by completely overwhelming you with something. I think what I might do is I might, if anyone has seen the Space Girl stuff that I've been doing, I might start with that system, and I'll bring that system in, and we will have a look at how frightening that system is. But then by the end of it, you will be comfortable understanding that system. So I'll go through and I will deconstruct that system for you in such a way that you can get a fair idea of what's going on in that system and how complex something can look with it actually being quite simple. And then we might start building some very, very simple systems just out of some of the very basic 2D stuff. We won't talk about Voyager at this stage. We'll build some 2D systems, and I might talk about some of the things like some of the way that we use the loopers, how we use color, and how you can start off with your very own designer system where you build it from scratch and you do something that you can control, rather than just kind of flopping in there, hitting the dice and going, I have no idea what's going on. We'll start with some systems where you can kind of build something, a simple something, and you'll have full control over what you're doing and you'll be fully confident to do that. So that's what we'll do next week.
Sounds amazing.
Awesome.
Excellent.
Looking forward to it, Peter.
Well, thanks, guys. Yeah, next week we'll get into it'll start becoming good fun. We'll start building things and you'll start seeing, there'll be lots of moments of, now I understand why that does that. So I'll be trying to bring you my 20 years of those experiences.
Fantastic.